Thank you so much. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Carlos Bustamante. I'm the CEO of a company called Galatea Bio. Most of what I'll be talking about today is work I did as an academic when I was a professor at Stanford and chair of the Department of Biomedical Data Science and Genetics. So what I'd like to do is sort of walk you through where this field that I've been a part of now for 20 years has really hit a limit in terms of our ability to do computation and analysis at scale, and how the ideas of distributed finance actually became core to how we're thinking about these problems and really powering the next generations of tools that we're using. So I'm by nature a data scientist, but a data scientist that's really worked across a series of applications. I'll begin by saying I am not a member of the accounting faculty. That's really not my bailiwick. I am as I said, a data scientist who has just learned a ton by operating in the real world and working in applications of tools and technologies, mostly to problems in biology and health. I'm also an active investor and operator. I was a venture partner at Fidelity's early stage biotech group, and I'm now, as I mentioned, really operating a company now in Miami, and we're just beginning. It's a biobank of the Americas that's accelerating population-driven genomic discoveries. And at the core, what we are trying to do is really take a very simple idea, which is that there's tremendous value in studying the genetics in underrepresented groups, linking that information, making it available to all, to really power the next generation of discoveries of health and disease. And what will be hopefully come full circle is that I think a key piece of this is to put a ton of this material through permissions that are effectively going to issue NFTs to people to control how their information is managed up the distillation chain into products and services that will be monetized. And in fact, it is the ability of people to control their information and set those permissions that will actually create at the core of the trust equation, that nugget of value creation that will actually compound. And so it's, I think, a very core idea to what we're thinking about. So I want to take us now back to how I got interested in this problem. And it's actually a very, very core idea to what the medical school at Stanford wanted to do. Namely, the dean was interested in delivering precision health at scale for all. So that may sound like a bit of a tagline, and it is. But let me just walk you through what our problem was as a medical school. So I sat really at the root of what we called the knowledge tree, if you'll believe that, and the logic that we articulated to the board and others at the core of decision making at the medical school was that if we want to be able to deliver preeminent care, we're going to need to root this in just an inordinate amount of information and data that we're able to model and make available. And so Stanford is a premier academic medical center. We're also in a part of the country that is blessed to have an embarrassment of riches and an embarrassment of health. And so it's a big suburban hospital trying to deliver care to an already well-served population. And so a big part of this was also how you position an academic medical center that's the second most expensive medical center after Boston for future growth. And so I would argue that if you were just to look at the balance sheet, all big universities are hedge funds with educational tax write-offs. At least that's certainly how Harvard operates. And Stanford is a big hospital with a school attached. In that, $2.5 billion of Stanford's but operating budget come from the medical school, and it's about 20%. 20% come from the rest. So we really are the tail that wags the dog. And so when you think about that enterprise, it is just a massive, massive business. And in thinking about how you grow, it's not trivial. It really is a major issue that academic medical centers face. They have rather constrained business models, and the last year of COVID should be an example to all of us of just how everything can change on a dime, and it's very hard to know who's making and not making money, how well are they doing, and how is that financial health translating into actual delivery of care. So in that context, we also faced a really serious issue, namely that a disproportionate amount of chronic disease, which is what we're trying to cure and solve for, is found in underrepresented minority populations. Yet the vast majority of what we were doing and what we are doing in terms of studying the genetics of these diseases, which ultimately are about identifying patients at risk, right? The whole reason you want genetics is to get ahead of the problem. And I'm going to spend a lot of time today on the problem of delivering care for patients at risk of cardiovascular disease, and in particular, a subset of patients that have a very pernicious form of cardiovascular disease called familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a form of cardiovascular disease that comes from just way too much bad cholesterol. And that bad cholesterol is through no fault of your own. It literally is your genes that cause you to have that high cholesterol in a small subset of people. And most of those people don't know they have this gene. And so they end up finding out in their 30s and 40s when they show up with an early heart attack or stroke, right? And so we want to get ahead of that problem. And from a logical point of view, it should be easy to get ahead of. It's a very tough problem. And so I want to walk through that and sort of lay it up for how it is a lens through which we can look for the rest of what's coming in terms of potential solutions. So I spent a lot of time on this problem, and I called a lot of attention to this problem, and kind of made myself a bit of a difficult person with respect to the National Institutes of Health and calling them on, some of this really just missed opportunity, if we could put it that way. So about a decade ago, I wrote a piece for a magazine called Nature. This is a scientific journal that most scientists sort of subscribe to. It's where the structure of DNA was published 60 years ago. So most scientists read Nature, and then I got the kind of op-ed in Nature for that week, and I kind of called attention to the massive issue that 95%, literally 95% of what we know came only from populations of European descent, which was Europe and it was mostly the UK and Iceland and Finland, because those were the countries that had gotten ahead of getting genetic studies done. About 5 years ago, there was a kind of refresh of this. When they looked at it, it turns out that China had made a big investment in genomics in the late 90s, early 2000s. They started an institute called the Beijing Genomics Institute, BGI, and BGI had a $10 billion loan from the Chinese Central Development Bank, and that went real far. They spent a lot of money on genomics, and they moved the needle on genomics for China. And it was great. And the rest of the world is literally just catching up. So the vast majority of studies are still done in populations of European descent. The rest are done in China, and we don't know much about literally the rest of the world. So individuals of Indian Asian ancestry, for example, I would argue are at some of the highest risks. So if a woman comes in for hereditary cancer screening, if she's a woman from Utah, 98% of the time, you can give her a definitive answer about whether or not she carries a mutation in a gene called BRCA1 or 2, which is one of the breast cancer genes. If that woman is African-American or Hispanic, she might get, a conclusive answer, maybe 85 to 90% of the time. If that woman's Indian Asian, she might only get an answer 70% of the time. So the databases just are really lacking. And the places in the world that there's less sampling in is obviously the parts of the world that are missing the most, but they're also the parts of the world that may be the biggest opportunity to identify new biological targets that could be part of a next generation of medications that I'll also talk about. And the other problem is that everything compounds, as you all know better than most. And so it's not about starting today, it's about starting 30 years ago, as you probably tell many of your students and clients and others, right? This isn't, wish you coulda, woulda, shoulda. And that's where the NIH is, coulda, woulda, shoulda. They should have started building cohorts in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to try to solve this problem. And they haven't, and I'll tell you, for example, in California, where I most recently lived before moving to Florida, the majority of kids born aren't individuals of Caucasian ancestry. The modal ancestors they're Hispanic kids. And then after kids, they're white kids, usually of admixed Hispanic ancestry, and then they're Black kids, and so on and so forth, and many Asian kids. And so we're missing a ton, even in children, that we need to get ahead of. So I got frustrated with this problem several years ago, and I'll talk more about this in my lecture. And so we were part of really the largest study in the world at the time of diverse human populations. The woman here who led this project, Genevieve Wojcik, was a postdoc in my lab at Stanford. She's now a professor at Johns Hopkins. And we literally did the largest study in the world at the time of diverse human genomes linked to cardiovascular disease from the United States. And it was about 50,000 people, nowhere near the kind of millions that are in other databases, but it was the best you could do in terms of getting to every sample in a freezer that the NIH had access to. And we went out and did a large set of studies. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but if you open up the New York Times or most NPR, whatever your favorite news source is, Wall Street Journal for me, or the Financial Times, you'll read about some genetic discovery, and we sort of did simultaneous genetic discovery around 26 kinds of traits. So we went out after inflammation traits that include C-reactive protein, if you've ever heard of that as a measure of inflammation, white blood cell count, platelets. These are the kinds of things that you would normally get in a doctor's report. Cholesterol levels, like your HDL or bad cholesterol, your HDL's high, good cholesterol, LDL's your bad cholesterol, and so on. And there are genes for all of this, right? And you can find these genes and you can see what's different in one group versus another. The point of this is that we reached a limit. That was it. That was all the information available in the bank. And so how do you move beyond that? And so my logic is we're going to take a page from what decentralized finance is doing. And really the notions of decentralized finance are far more fundamental principles about how we should think about data than they are fundamental principles about how we should think about finance. Maybe I'll repeat that. They're less about, accounting principles, if I could, than they are about the philosophical underpinnings as to how we're going to move data around. But in the same way that, we use financial accounting to understand and transmit information about the health of companies and organizations, we're going to need rules of the road and ability to essentially audit the trail of information that compounds to create knowledge in healthcare. And a huge part of this is that there are many links along that trail. And so you lose a ton of information. And our hope is that by kind of closing the ecosystem of data loss, you'll actually create just really good incentives that force people to really do the right thing in terms of making data available. So I'll be maybe a little bit more explicit as an analyst and what I'm trying to push forward. So if I think about the world of distributed finance, right? The decentralized world tries to make the following case, right? In a traditional system, we need to go through the reconciliation of accounts across, ledgers of that sit on different, intermediate banks. So you write a check to somebody in Florida from California, then the local state bank needs to clear here and all the way up through the Reserve Bank of New York and make its way back down, right? As you all know from 101, that's what you need to do to have a check cleared, and might take several days. You just need to go through all of these clearing, including the reconciliation of the reference banks to themselves at the top, and we even think about the logic of the interest rate as the meeting point of future and past, and the daily lending rate as really a measure of the liquidity in the system. In a decentralized finance system, this kind of all goes away, right? There is no need for an overnight lending rate to have the clearinghouse, kind of like on Lombard Street 100 years ago, clean up. You really live on a peer-to-peer network. and you sort of keep many ledgers that have to be synchronized. And if they're not synchronized, someone's cheating, and in some sense, it's a little bit crazy, except that the proof is in the trust, and the logic really does hold. And so code is hard to fake. And my sense is that we will all be living in these systems, whether we believe so or not. I mean, I think it's an inevitability of how this has to evolve, particularly because so much of the intermediate step here is not value creation. It really is just clearinghouse stuff that could be accelerated. And I want to live in a world of data liquidity. So I don't want to have my check need 3 days to clear. I'd much rather live in a world where cryptography assures me with some modicum of error about whether something's going to happen or not. And in my world, what that means is I don't need to create one database to rule them all, right? So there was a real belief that in order for us to be able to do genetics at scale, we sort of need to create Skynet of sorts, or Gattaca, or whatever you want to call it. That's not how it's going to work. In fact, that's not how anybody wants it to work. We really do want to have these local genetic databases that are protected. And so how do you verify? That's a big issue. So if I have a finding in one genetic database, for example, how do I verify that? And so one of the ideas that had been put out there is this notion that we should think about distributed computation as a potential solution. And so that's what I'm trying to build towards. The idea being that if we think about a centralized analysis, everybody collects data and it's all sent to one coordinating center. And that one coordinating center is now tasked with doing the analysis. It's sort of the massive reconciliation of accounts that happens at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York when the other banks are able to clear and make sure that they have enough liquidity to swap accounts. That's not what happens when we think about, for example, just aggregating the financial health of organizations and reporting them, and then looking at the statistics. That's what we normally call a meta study, right? Where, look, there's just no way we can bring all the data together, but we can calculate what we would call sufficient statistics. I would say we normally think about as financial reports, which are namely our records of cash flows and balance sheets that speak to financial health of organizations over time. And so your analysis of that is not dissimilar to a psychologist who takes 8 different studies that purport to find an association between genetics and some trait and try to make sense of, okay, this was a good result, this is a terrible result, I don't believe these people's numbers, these are really good numbers. But at the end of the day, you're really sort of making judgment calls without being able to look at all the underlying data, right? I mean, if we're honest, right, there's only so much that you can really glean in financial reports. And we find out later that, oh, wait a second, people cook their numbers. How did that happen? How could that be? Well, there are lots of ways to hide in plain sight. And that's true for meta-analysis. We've lived with that problem in science, and what we call it is the problem of reproducibility. You call it fraud, but it's the same thing. I would argue that what the world needs is what we're moving towards, namely the logic of what we call meta study 2.0, or decentralized finance. Namely, every database makes a computation, sends it to a trust node. That trust node does a check, sends it back, and you have a crosstalk. And if there is not a synchronization among the ledgers, someone's lying, right? And that's part of the logic here. Well, and not lying, rather there's heterogeneity, which could be, right? It could well be that genes that are associated with diabetes in one population may not be associated in another population. And that turns out to be kind of the same logic. And so that's really the kind of central message of what I hope to communicate today, that there's a real synergy between where the world of finance is going in terms of your need to audit and ensure that reporting of both private and public entities is, as transparent as possible. And so investors can make sound decisions, and governments can set policy. The same thing holds in my world of trying to make claims between genetics and this trait and that gene, and whether or not we should give somebody a drug. They are not dissimilar decisions, and they absolutely meet in the marketplace in that I'm having discussions with the money folks all the time about why or not should they or should they not cover a particular medication, and what is the genetic logic behind that happening. So with that, maybe what I'll do is go through my view of how the world of healthcare data is going to shift, how most of that is going to be driven by giving individuals more and more control over the permissions of their data, whether or not they understand it. I mean, it's not dissimilar, again, to financial data and the amount of information that one can or choose not to share with different entities, and whether or not people understand what they're signing on to when they sign on to forms about how their financial information, whether or not it's linked to their person, is or is not shared. So the same thing holds for health data. And I would argue for many people, especially those people that don't have a lot of financial data or a lot of finance, their healthcare data may end up being some of the most important assets that are on their personal balance sheet, and because it will compound over time, and they may end up being compensated in tokens and coins that are exchangeable for real tokens and coins, if we will, these worlds will meet. This is a little bit of the multiverse where I'm teleporting in from bio world and telling you there are bio coins or bio NFTs. These things will meet in the marketplace through Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so we should just be prepared for that kind of encounters of the third kind. So let me root this in a bit more of actual kind of model of data. And this is what I used to call the world according to Carlos. When I was a biomedical data scientist, I'd go out and say, look, if I think about healthcare data, it's all about buckets and about who cares about that kind of data. So let me take us back to the dean at Stanford, who's running a $2 billion a year operation in a hospital. He really cares about the data of what we call care providers. He wants electronic health record data. He'd like his genetics and omics and imaging data, pathology outcomes, RX's prescription data. And of course, he wants all that data integrated. And in some sense, that's like, a no-brainer. Of course, you should integrate that data, right? If you're a care provider, why would you keep those data silos? It's a little bit like asking, oh, this internet thing is just going to be for real. Should I put up a website? And it's the 1990s. It's like, yeah, if you're a store and you're not putting up a website, you're going to get run over. But if you put up a store, that doesn't mean you're going to turn into Amazon. So just because you've integrated all your data doesn't mean you're going to know what to do with it, or that you can do anything with it. And a big part of what ends up happening is that care provider data is very different depending on where you look. So in the United States, for example, the vast majority of this is billing data, because everything in the US healthcare system that costs over $50, you're going to keep a bill for it. Like, there's just no way. You charge people $50 for Tylenol at the hospital, you're going to bill for that, right? So there's an incredibly granular view of how an individual careens across the healthcare system, particularly when they're, admitted to hospital. That doesn't mean we have any idea about the actual health of the country based on lab data. And the current COVID situation is just indicative, right? There's nobody, you choose what statistics you want to believe in, right? And the same is true for healthcare data. In Britain, it's kind of the opposite. In Britain, it's probably illegal for you to find out how much you spent on a particular patient, but you know exactly how much, the British system spent on postage in, 2019. So, they're just totally different views of the same system. Just what do you care about? Do you care about the billing data, or do you care about the health data? And these bidirectional arrows for me are really just indicative of what what we normally think of as healthcare economics, namely it's a conversation between providers and insurance, right? So are we going to pay for it or not? Qualies and dollies. What's it worth? Oh, this much. And if it's above that, then I'm not going to pay. So this is all kind of negotiated pricing and the nonsense that we know happens in the U.S. healthcare system. I mean, it is just abysmally bad in terms of actually delivering good efficiency. My analogy is if we paid for gasoline the way we pay for things in healthcare, you'd go to the gas station, you may or may not fill up, you'd have no idea how much you pay, whether or not that gas station is in network or not, and oh boy, don't try to get tires there because they're not going to cover it, right? And that's because you can't insure against utilization, right? You can only insure against rare events, and so the whole notion that we have health insurance in this country is a misnomer. We have bad software for managing your obligation as an employer. 60% of Americans get their healthcare through their employer, and most big employers are self-insured. They pay themselves, as many of you know. So it literally is Bank of America that's paying when the teller with FH has a heart attack at 35. It's not, some magical insurer that, is actually mitigating risk, right? And ultimately, most of these data aren't in any one data silo anyway, because people switch insurers as part of, select benefit. And they also, move and they go to different healthcare providers, and sometimes they die and they don't always tell their doctors everything, so like there is no one database to rule them all. Rather, there are a bunch of individuals with data that's kind of living everywhere, but all that stuff can be integrated, right? And in many ways, I don't need every piece of data to make a healthcare decision about an individual. Give me a break. I need to use data in the smartest way possible to manage and do decisions, which means data is going to compound over time. I'll have more and more information about individuals to tranche them into treatment pathways. And I may also have a ton of information that I can mine for new and better solutions. The last bucket here is what I would call legal and regulatory. And to me, this is all just warping of the space, right? These are just the naysayers that prevent data from flowing as well as it should, particularly if you could create systems that can shake hands and APIs, right? I've never met an API I didn't like. I've met many, many, many bureaucrats that hold data up through not an understanding of what they're talking about. So an API knows what it's talking about by definition. So that's what I want to move on a world to, right? All that data should be living on, direct computer to computer linkages that you can, really, get to talk to each other. All right. So how would any of this actually make financial sense from, and how do we value these kinds of databases? Well, one way to do this is comps. So one comp is, we know, 3 years ago, GSK and 23andMe signed a partnership valued at $300 million to allow GSK access to their database. And, how well did that work, and what did they get out of it? Well, some of you may have seen Ann Wojcicki, who was just on, Moneyball 2 days ago, and talking about how they've got 40 some targets that have come out of this. So sometimes it's a smashing success. I mean, it's just an unbelievable success. There's no doubt there's a treasure trove of information in genetic data that will accelerate the discovery of new medications and move us towards a kind of much better world of tailoring therapies to our genetics. The biggest issue is privacy. How is this information used? How do I make sense of it? How do I control it? At which point you go back to the notion of blockchain and the ability of smart contracts to enable data liquidity. And the biggest challenge here is that most of these data are being used in one and only one real way, which is to mine for drugs. And the reason is it's an incredibly lucrative business. And it's a hard business. It is really, really difficult to bring drugs to market. It costs an inordinate amount of money. And in fact, it often costs about $2 billion and 10 years to bring one new drug to market. So if 23andMe for $300 million gets them 40 leads, let's say it's got, this number's not 5, but 40, well, look, you're just, cooking with jet fuel. Right? Like there's just no way that this isn't going to be the way it works. So if they get one drug out through the pipeline, they've already beat the $2 billion price tag. If they get two drugs to the pipeline, it's obvious that this is, more than a one-trick pony. If they get three drugs to the pipeline, no other drug company will ever do drug development in any other way, but using human genome variation as the core way to make this happen. So that's a, just really, to me, obvious kind of future that we're looking at. And this is one of my favorite examples of how genetics gets turned into drugs. This is the discovery of these magical molecules called PCSK9 inhibitors. These came about from studying families with high cholesterol, as I was mentioning before. So we can go out and study the genetics of high cholesterol. And one of the things that we find is that there's a particular gene called PCSK9, and that gene has a really peculiar property. Namely, the more of this gene that you have, the more of your body produces cholesterol, the higher your risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So it's kind of an indicator of what may be going on, namely that there's a directional link between bad cholesterol and heart attacks. And so you can also make an antibody to PCSK9, kind of like the way your body makes antibodies to COVID. And if you gave somebody, recovered plasma or antibodies to COVID and they wouldn't have a severe COVID, you gave somebody antibodies to PCSK9, you're going to pull down their PCSK9 and consequently you're going to lower their cholesterol. At least that would be the hypothesis. And this all comes from looking at the genetics, right? So you look at individuals with very high cholesterol, it's just a bell curve, individuals with very low cholesterol, and you compare the genes on either side, and that tells you what's going on. And this is the condition. It's called familial hypercholesterolemia. 90% of people don't know they have this. I repeat that, 90% of people don't know they have this. It's about 1 in 250 people, right? This is massive. It's a huge issue. And if you have familial hypercholesterolemia from both sides of your family, you're 20 times as likely to just die of a heart attack and stroke. I mean, it is a terrible, terrible, terrible situation to be in, particularly because it is completely, asymptomatic until you have the heart attack. You cannot tell from your body how much cholesterol you're producing. It even begins to accumulate. The cholesterol begins to accumulate, on the person's skin. And that's one of the first indications, these external, bumps that come from this much cholesterol. So, the logic here is that if this is the typical person, and these are cholesterol years, if you have one bad copy of the gene, by the time, you're in your 30s, you have the cholesterol profile of somebody in their 60s. And if you were unfortunate enough, again, mom and dad, then by the time you're a teenager, you have, the heart of a 60-year-old. So that's just, a bad situation to be in. What's wild is that this is a condition that absolutely responds to therapy. And so if we knew who they were and you were able to find out, you could put them on therapies and avert all the heart attack and all the heartache. So I'm going to sort of skip to this and just say that the genetics proved this out, and it was just a spectacular success. And as I say, fascinating. What's the problem? Why aren't we giving everybody this medication? A third of Americans have high cholesterol. So if we gave a new cholesterol lowering drug to a third of Americans, what would that do to healthcare? Depends on how much the drug costs. Well, this drug is only $12,000 a year. Third of Americans, we're going to increase healthcare spend $4,000 a year per man, woman, and child. It's not going to happen. It's literally not going to happen. So here you go. We found literally a magic bullet. We could literally inject everybody today with this medication. It would pretty much pull down cholesterol for everybody pretty harmlessly. They're even less, side effects than statins, but that's not going to happen. I mean, we would spend more on this one drug than all their drugs combined, right? So how do you decide who gets it and who doesn't, right? That is the name of the game in healthcare economics. And again, data is king here. So, and this is an example of what the world ought to look like. So in a rational world, what would happen is we would use genetics to screen people. So if mom and dad had high cholesterol, maybe screen them at birth, because some of these people may need to start on this medication when they're children, so they don't die of a heart attack in their 30s. So like if mom and dad are sick, like definitely all the kids should be screened. And if you didn't get screened because your mom and dad were sick, you should definitely get screened when you're going into school. That way we would make sure that every child, going to school is getting the medication they need. Let's imagine that doesn't work, right? You can't get the kids involved. Fine. By the time people are graduating from high school and going to the military or college, like we should be screening them. We should be doing adult screening. None of this happens. The average age at which somebody ends up on the registry is like 39. These people start taking statins already in their 30s because they have off the charts cholesterol. And the average age of diagnosis is my age, 47. If I have FH by my age, I've got 90% occlusion. I'm looking at, the other end. Right. So how do we get ahead of this problem? There is no better, I think, example for a kind of screen and anonymous search than FH, which is what we did. We've actually been working on systems to build this because the vast majority of people who are prescribed this medication can't get it. 62% eventually don't get it, ever, even though they need it. 95% are denied the first time. So this is a big problem. People need to get this medication. They can't get it because we don't have the data to support it, right? And a couple of years ago, I went down to the great state of Tennessee and gave this lecture. And I had a very smart young man say, Dr. Bustamante, I really appreciated your talk. I'll have you know, I'm in charge of Medicaid for the state of Tennessee. And we cover PCSK9 inhibitors. Thank you very much. We just need you to fill out a series of forms that, validate whether or not you meet criteria, which is at least a great start, right? I mean, that's exactly what we want. We'd like to be able to, kind of just knock these out and say, check, 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 check. This person is eligible. So I think it's exactly the right direction to go. And at the end of the day, folks, this is all simply a consequence that we've had an explosion in healthcare costs. There's just no other way to look at it. The United States in the 60s spent 5% of GDP on healthcare. Today, we spend 20% of GDP. Healthcare is the number one industry in the country. It overtook retail and manufacturing, before the pandemic. Post-pandemic, of course, healthcare is like the only industry in the country, right? To the destruction of everything else. So, how are you going to get ahead of this? And the logic is you're not going to rely on the crazy, brittle, must kind of go, system of employer provided health insurance, because it's just unsustainable. People will choose to just get cash instead of getting their healthcare benefits and buy it on a much better term. So, I think we're going to move towards a world of subscription health systems, where you're basically voting with your data, and whatever data you don't want to give up, you pay more for in premiums. And I think that's the only logical thing. And part of this is that healthcare expenditures are ridiculously leptocurtic. So it is the proverbial, tail takes everything. So the top 1% of claimants eat up 22% of the dollars, right? The top 5% eat up 50% of the dollars, right? And a lot of this is end of life care, last 6 months, et cetera. But operationally, what this means is that, in an homage to Pareto, 80-20, right? 20% eat up 80% of the resources, meaning that the bottom half only has a tiny amount. And the bottom half here isn't the bottom half of the country in terms of income. It's the bottom half of the country in terms of utilization of healthcare. And so this is all the healthy people. There's no incentive to give, additional care to healthy people to keep them healthy. There's only incentive to bill sick people for the sick care that they need and wait until they're sick to give them more and more expensive care. I mean, it is literally just a sick care system incentivized to deliver sick care. There are no incentives to deliver health in the US healthcare system. And so something like PCSK9 inhibitors that avert health would only be covered if you have so much data that it overwhelms the tilt in the system. And the only way to do that is through a decentralized system that overturns the existing entrenched system. So you literally need to go punch at the tertiary and quaternary care centers in order to avert this. And so, like, I want my colleagues in cardiovascular disease to just not need to be doing transplants and not to be doing stents and not to be doing cabbages, right? Like, because we were able to prevent them from having that condition in the first place. And so it is competition, but it's competition, and I think in a healthy, good way. And part of this is that healthcare delivery is literally just supply chain optimization. It just happens to be a ridiculously complex supply chain. And so how do you optimize on this? This is what decentralized finance is literally built to do, right? It is built to crash through the nonsense by creating the right incentives for the right actors to move in the right direction. And so let me give you, just some concrete thoughts here. As a data scientist, none of this is about tools. I wish it were about tools. I wish it were about, oh no, you need to buy better learning methods from me, or you need to come in and buy better, analytics. Like, it's not about the analytics. It's literally about the permission files to mine on the data. Like, another way of saying it, it's not about the drill bits that are going to go into the oil fields. It's about your right to mine in those oil fields. And right now, that's just being, invented. And the stakes are massive. These aren't small numbers. These are massive numbers. And I'll, move to some examples of that. This is one of my favorite examples of how we can kind of begin to tilt the system. So this is the work of a colleague at Vanderbilt. They literally have built a wonderful database where they were following people longitudinally. They were able to get genetics on people. They were able to look at how people use the healthcare system at Vanderbilt and see, okay, what do they bill for? And they could ask, does this patient look like a patient that bills for cystic fibrosis, hemochromatosis, Lee-Fraumeni syndrome? These are all known genetic conditions. And the answer is absolutely. I mean, this is just like what you guys do. Like, can you guys look at financial transactions and tell you whether something looks cooked or not? Absolutely. And that's what we're doing. I mean, it's really no different than that. And so this is an example of literally just looking at transactions of healthcare utilization and whether, when you bin those transactions, they look like they come from somebody with cystic fibrosis or not. And guess what? You can use transactions to figure out whether someone has cystic fibrosis. You can look at transactions to see whether they have Marfan syndrome. By the way, this is what Lincoln probably had. Achondroplasia, or dwarfism, hemochromatosis, Lee-Fraumeni syndrome. So all of these have sufficient lift in the databases to be identified. The most wonderful example is phenylketonuria, or PKU. And the answer is, everybody gets their advice for PKU from the back of a Diet Coke can. Everybody knows if the kiddo has PKU, don't give them phenylalanine. And that's why, even though genetically we have PKU in this country, we don't have mental retardation due to PKU because you've put children on a special diet. And it's the one success story of the last 30, 40 years before the advent of specialized medications, for example, for cystic fibrosis by Vertex, that you actually have a potential cure for a genetic disease, namely, let's not give them the molecule that, and in the other case is food, but in their case is toxic. And so how do you scale that out? We did the very same thing at Stanford with familial hypercholesterolemia. These are two of my colleagues. They literally built the database, mined the database. They were able to find patients at risk of cardiovascular disease. Sorry, I just lost this. Go back to resume sharing. Thank you. So they were looking at patients with cardiovascular disease, and they, brought together clinical notes, procedures, prescription, laboratory measurements, built a model. We then scaled out the model to 15 million patients in the United States, and we built a big map of where all the FH patients are. We also built the website where, if you're a medical provider, you can go on, unlock that, and see, where your presumptive FH patients are. And based on that, you can now begin to get them reimbursed for PCSK9 inhibitors. And we don't want to give PCSK9 inhibitors to everybody. We only want to give PCSK9 inhibitors to the FH patients that require them. And so that to me was a first demonstration that this could actually happen. The other wonderful thing that's happened is that there's a company called Color Genomics out of my neck of the woods, and they're basically gunning for Stanford's same business. That they're offering a very ultra low, cheap version of this test to be able to, offer testing at scale for everybody. And this to me is just a classic example from like Clay Christensen of the innovator's dilemma. Namely, you have an existing technology that is the tried and true, and everybody says, "Oh, there's no way. I mean, this is just the way to do it," and it meets the performance demand of the market, right? The high end of the market, right? So the enterprise solutions, landlines, until something that's just not as good initially, but then quickly overtakes. And today, like many businesses are just run off of people's cell phones. They don't need to be on the they don't need to be on the best year. And this is just the data on the use of landlines and cell phones, where we've accelerated the use of cell phones to the point that crossover actually happened in 2016, 2017. So in less than 15 years, you've basically replaced the dominant technology of 100 years, right? So this stuff happens ridiculously fast, and there's no doubt that we're going to be seeing something similar, both in the application of data science to genetics, but also in the application of distributed finance to your world. And so, again, to me, this is a clear example of, faster, better, cheaper, where I'm really hoping that they're able to take out my very favorite, place to get care. And I think that's the way it should be. And the role of what we're thinking about here of data has been obvious, and it's been obvious for quite a while, right? So this is the cliche that data is the new oil. I would argue that's been true for quite a while. It was true when you just look at the balance sheets of these companies. They overtook the oil industry years and years ago in terms of being the largest companies in the world. When we were in college, the biggest companies in the world were the oil companies. And the second is just the titanic move in health data science. So when you think about the acquisition and merger of CVS Aetna, it's really clear that this is really driven by a data play. And so if you just look at who's got cash on hand, it's obvious what's going to happen to healthcare. It's going to be disrupted by the tech companies. So you have, Apple, Microsoft, Google, all with massive cash reserves. What are they going to do with that cash? Like, buy back their stock? Okay. They could buy each other's stock. Okay. Well, what other way could they, meet the fiduciary duty to shareholders? Going into industries like healthcare, right? And of course, like there's no bigger industry to go to, so they have no choice. It is their fiduciary duty to go into healthcare. And that's what the Apple Health play has been about, right? It's been about the devices now tapping into healthcare, largely as a way for Apple to sell you more devices and then more subscriptions. But that data is now being repurposed in all matter for exactly what is the treasure trove that my world relies on, namely patient-reported outcomes and people sharing with us what it is that they need to share with us so that we can do the genetics research. And this is expanding beyond just genetics data. Now we're tracking all kinds of data, including a matter of other biomarkers. So that biomarker data will be integrated with your genetic data. And the logic is pretty straightforward, right? You will be moving into a world of blockchain for data authenticity, where the doctor and an individual agree on a particular plan, and that plan may be you need to take PCSK9 inhibitors, or you need to be on a mixture of exercise and a drug regimen, and that information will absolutely be put into a shared ledger that can then be authenticated by third-party auditing. You're not going to rely on the doctor to tell you whether the patient did it. You're not going to rely on the patient to tell you whether they did it. You're going to rely on a system, that has already been built to basically provide that information as a means of pricing risk. And we are going to live in a world of human Geico. There's just no doubt about that. And here's another example. This is one of the companies that I was an early advisor to. I wrote their white paper on the use of blockchain or helped them write their white paper on the use of blockchain for consenting and sharing genetic data. They're now building a rare disease network to make this happen. And if you thought PCSK9 inhibitors were expensive, they're just the tip of the iceberg. So a couple of years ago, Spark Therapeutics got approval for their cure of blindness. So first of all, there's a cure for blindness, especially if you have one of these mutations. So that's amazing. But it just happens to be $850,000 per eye. But it's blindness. So how do you price that? So the logic here is you're only going to give this to a person if they have that genetic condition. And it's not a medication, it's actually a surgery. So you're going to only authorize CHOP and a handful of extraordinarily monopolistic places to offer the therapy. And so it's just going to be the way of the world. But like everything else, genomes also used to cost $850,000. Today, they're hundreds of dollars. And you drive down price through competition, right? It's the only way to do this. So here is the logic on Luxturner, which is that you actually have a money back guarantee. So I really like this. Namely, you have such belief in the medication. Cancer drugs don't come with a money back guarantee, right? But this does. So if I administer the drug and the patient doesn't get a cure for blindness, then you can claw back what you paid. And I like that. I think that's exactly the right way to do it. But again, how am I going to adjudicate this? I need to adjudicate it on the blockchain with third-party software that's auditing, not believe what the doctor's telling me or necessarily what the patient is reporting. And again, Luxturner is not the most expensive drug. This was done actually before Zolgensma got approved. Zolgensma is a drug for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a terrible disease. And it luckily helps improve some of the symptoms, but it's $2 million. So again, this is an example of before you're going to give somebody $2 million for a procedure, you're going to want to make sure that they're the right person. It is the right drug. They really need it, that you're going to monitor them, follow them going forward. And you may need to split that cost over many, many, many years of benefit to that individual. How's that going to work? So it's a little bit like a mortgage, right? You get the house in the beginning, but you pay it off over time. So could you have a mortgage for drugs? Again, this may sound a little bit dystopian, but Andrew Lowe actually worked this out and worked out this example precisely in the case of PCSK9 and others. So there's absolutely cases to be made for bonds that sit on top and can be paid out over some period of time, that a particular benefit accrues to an individual, and where there's a necessity for that obligation to be split across the employers that the individual has as the holders of the bond, because they're the ones that would have to pay off they're the ones who would be on the hook for paying for care. So maybe this might be a place to stop for some questions, and I have more material, but this might be a logical place to stop and just say that healthcare delivery costs worldwide are the biggest challenges to economic growth and well-being. This is pre-COVID and certainly is true now, ever more so. This is not a problem of innovation, right? How many innovative solutions have come this year for COVID? A gazillion. How many innovations for testing? A gazillion. It wasn't just about innovation. It was about getting technology in the hands of people. This is a supply chain problem. This can be absolutely made far better, cheaper, if we're able to share data and make this available. And so I'm excited about the way consumers will lead the way. I'm excited about the way value will accrue. I'm excited about the role that health coins and others will play. And to bring it back to my original example from a data analytics point of view, this is all about ensuring that algos can travel and compute on compartmentalized data stores, and that the solution can be checked and verified with a thumbs up or thumbs down. So thank you. It's been a privilege and a pleasure, and happy to take questions from the audience and go with the flow. So thanks so much.
So we do have a question. It's actually a two-part question. You talked about cryptocurrencies and blockchain in relation to biodata and how it helps the collecting and analyzing of the same. Can you share the thoughts of how cryptocurrency and blockchain can help other industries, i.e. professional services, manufacturing, retail, and how the use of these new technologies can help in the area of sustainability?
Okay, that's a multi-part question. Can you break it up for me again?
Absolutely. So the first question is, you talked about cryptocurrency and blockchain in relation to biodata and how it helps the collecting and analyzing of the same. Can you share your thoughts on how cryptocurrency and blockchain can help other industries like professional services, manufacturing, and retail?
Absolutely. So in manufacturing, it has the same kind of supply chain logic, I would say, in terms of handoff and shaking between components. So we're, for example, using the passing on of the checksum to ensure that the data file can move to the next stage of analysis. So, certainly when we think about sequencing a genome, it's not a simple process, right? It's you try to automate this process, and so the production of genetic data itself is a manufacturing problem with many steps in between that are kind of monitored through this kind of shaking of the blockchain. I would say in retail, and again, I'll maybe use bio retail as an example. You can imagine putting on a blockchain if you go to the pharmacy to get a medication, whether or not your genetics indicates that you should or shouldn't receive that medication. So you can actually have warnings on the blockchain that prevent a transaction that shouldn't go through, right? Kind of like you might want to prevent the sale of alcohol to somebody under 21 or similar. And in terms of facilitating transaction, you're really moving forward the most important pieces that are necessary, namely data liquidity. So we're in the process of really trying to make it possible for big data stores to come about, and a big part of that is really creating ways for this to go forward. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, and the second part to that question was how does the use of the new technologies, how can they help in the area in sustainability?
Sustainability is a great example, and one that I'm excited about is actually in tracking of charismatic megafauna. So if you think about tigers in India, every tiger in India is going to have an NFT. I don't have a doubt about that. And the reason is they're already kind of celebrities. They're followed around. They've got cameras on the tigers. They're all in reserves, and that's just going to become more and more par for the course, right? Like all the Florida Panthers are radio collared, and I think in the world of bringing back endangered species, we're also talking about putting barcodes in that would allow you to track, and so if that's the charismatic megafauna argument, which has always been an argument in conservation genetics, I think the same will hold true for additional kinds of environmental economic transactions. So if I think about carbon credits, if I think about trying to value a forest, if I think about the kind of classic difficult valuation problems in environmental economics, that they are all just facilitated by the use of blockchain for data authenticity and the most logical form of valuation, which is comps.
All right. And the last question is one that we've actually been asking everyone is, at night, what keeps you up about cryptocurrencies and blockchain?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll give you, I like to call this, what's your Black Mirror kind of example. I think that the biggest worry is that it's just going to exacerbate the massive issue of what I call knowledge inequality. I don't really think wealth inequality is a big reflection of knowledge inequality. So is healthcare inequality, but it's fundamentally knowledge inequality. And so there's an argument that, this is just the same folks getting more of the same. Although my counter argument to that is I think the smartest decision you've seen this year is the president of El Salvador setting up Chivo Wallet and creating the Bitcoin push in LATAM. I mean, I think there's just no doubt. I mean, the logic of cryptocurrency. I'm from Venezuela, so the logic of cryptocurrency for Latin American finance and particularly keeping cash out of the hands of people you don't want to keep cash out of, I think is exactly 100% right, and it is a way for individuals and organizations to take power and possession themselves because it's an incredibly powerful technology if you build it right.
Wonderful. That's all the questions I have for now.
Excellent. If there are no additional questions, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to present. It's a privilege and a pleasure. And if anyone would like to get in touch, my email is carlos.bustamante@galatea.bio. And I can also just put that on here in the chat, and happy to share that with the attendance, and thank you for the opportunity. We're privileged to be part of the Miami tech community, and I'm also thrilled to be an adjunct at the university, and just so thrilled to be back home in Miami. So thank you so much, and I look forward to meeting and working with you all over the coming years.
And